May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, the one who gives us strength and the one who does redeem us. Amen. Would you like the good news first or the not so good news? The not so good news. You're going to be hearing me talk a lot this morning. At our annual meeting, you will hear me talk much longer than I'm about to preach. So the good news is my sermon is going to be very short, but you're going to hear a whole lot more of me and your vestry members and other leaders of this wonderful parish. Now, that's a wonderful invitation to a parish meeting, isn't it? To come and hear someone talk on and on and on. I do hope you come, because something big is going to happen at this annual meeting. If the Apostle Paul was onto something by comparing the Jesus followers and Jesus disciples to a body, and I believe he was, then what part of the body would you be? What part do you play? As you recall, Paul wrote to a group of Jesus followers, a church that we call it now, and a city of Corinth. We heard a reading just a moment ago, a letter to those disciples in Corinth. And those folks in Corinth were a mess. I don't have time in this sermon to give you a rundown, the history of the city of Corinth. It was full of all kinds of debauchery. And even within the church, members began to take sides. Believe that, if you can, a church with differing opinions. And it got so bad, according to Paul's letter, that people began saying, oh, well, you know, I preach better than Sandy. And Sandy might say, well, I pray better than Tim. And different people, Vanessa, Paul, Dale, San, all people began taking sides to say, oh, look at me, I'm more spiritual than you. And it caused such division that Paul wrote to them and said, cut it out. And he said, you know what, we're one body. We're a lot of members, but we're one body. We have all sorts of gifts. Even in this room, all sorts of gifts. We can't all do the same thing. Some of you operate more out of your brain, and you like using your brain. That doesn't mean you're any smarter or wiser than someone, but you have certain gifts with your brain. Some people have certain gifts with their heart, and so they dedicate their time in prayer guild and praying for each other and for the world. Some people are gifted with their hands, and so they go on things like group work camp in the summer, young people, and they use their hands for a week. And by the way, this is my chance to put the plug in. This summer for group work camp, we still need one more adult female. So if you are an adult female and you have some time this June to use your hand, we encourage you to think about that. We have all of these various gifts. And Paul wrote to them. He didn't have an annual meeting, at least I don't think so. We don't have that record. He didn't have an annual meeting, so he wrote letters to them. And he said, cut this out. We are all various members, but we are all one body. And he begins this letter by what you just heard this morning. When I came to you, I did not use lofty words or wisdom. The irony here is that the word Paul uses for wisdom is a play on the controversy that is going on within the church. Because these Corinthians in church were saying how some were wiser than others. And so Paul writes and says, oh yeah, you are wise. I didn't come to you in wisdom. So this way you are treating and acting one to another, that's not the way I came to you. I came to you with humility. If you can imagine that, Paul with humility. But Paul calling them to task, challenging them to relate and treat one another much differently than they had been doing. And consequently, once you treat one another differently in church, that means you treat one another in the world quite differently. It's a different sort of wisdom. It's not a wisdom that you read in the headlines. It's not a wisdom you read in the newspapers or on blogs. This wisdom is very different. So Paul is being quite ironic. The other irony we hear about this morning is that ironic thing we all need, but in heavy doses is not so good for us, that thing called salt. Now, salt is really not bad for you. In fact, if you are alive in part because of salt. Now, I'm not a physician, so please don't take any of my comments about salt to be medical advice. Please do follow your physician's orders. But salt is a good thing, and it's interesting that Jesus uses this image, this real basic thing that you and I take for granted, right? You and I take salt for granted. If we didn't, go home and count how many canisters of salt you have in your cupboard. I have 3. We take it for granted, and once upon a time, people did not take salt for granted. In fact, it was a very valuable commodity. It was like a currency of sorts. A number of months ago, I read a fascinating book. You can remember the title of this. It's called Salt, A History. And the writer documented how a number of trade routes all around the globe in different parts all over the globe, trade routes were built, cities were built to quarry salt and to trade salt. Salt is very important to us. For instance, ketchup was once upon a time tomatoes that were left to grow sour and bad, and you just put salt on it and it made it good. And hence we use it every day. Soy sauce, once upon a time, was developed by leaving fish out to rot. And you mix rotten fish with water and salt. And now we have soy sauce. So remember that the next time you order Chinese. Salt was so valuable that the Roman legion was paid by salt. Hence that phrase we use all the time. Are you worth your salt? So Jesus uses this wonderful image to say that you, those of you who decide to follow him, to become Jesus' disciples, those of you who are part of the church, are salt. We often think of salt as a preservative, don't we? No, salt is more than a preservative. Salt gives life. Salt is part of light. And Jesus says, all of you who follow me, you are the salt of the world. You are to offer life, be life, to a world that is very desperate to find life, a world that is in very desperate need to find health and wholeness and healing. And salt helps provide that healing. I invite you not only to come back, or to stay actually, for our annual meeting and come to hear part 2, but I challenge you in 2014 to think about those words Paul wrote, what Jesus said. Think about those words Paul wrote, that We are all members with all sorts of different gifts, and we're one body to show a world a very different sort of wisdom. So I challenge all of you in 2014, if you've not volunteered, if you've not gone to a work camp, particularly if you're an adult female that's never been to a work camp, if you have a desire to serve up here on the altar, to read, to use your hands to cook meals for facets, and to use your legs and feet to deliver those meals for facets. All of these wonderful things we do to show the world some semblance of life and light and health and some semblance of that. That is what we are called. You are the salt of the earth. You, each and every one of you, are salt. Amen.